Welcome to Weaving the Blanket, stories of faith, sacrifice, martyrdom, and the emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church of Bolivia. This is Season 3,
Episode 6, The Aymara Revolution, Part E, Repercussions and the Time of Transition. I am Reverend David Stevenson. During the 2-year time of transition, many of the GBGM missionaries seriously contemplating leaving after the 1976 General Assembly, but most kept a wait-and-see attitude.
In fact, as we will hear later from a woman who knows for a fact that GBGM still held out hopes of regaining some control over the IEMB, they had been grooming a Bolivian mestizo pastor for several years to become the bishop of the IEMB once it had to be a Bolivian. GBGM had paid for his schooling in Brazil, and he was a liberation theology pastor, matching the left-leaning theology of most of those in GBGM in New York. And they must have been heartened by the fact that he was elected to be one of the
3 leaders
who led during the time of transition. Local IEMB churches couldn't possibly pay a living wage to their pastors when the median income of Methodists, even as late as 2014, was less than $2 a day. But there was a big push to get the autonomous Methodist churches of South America to become financially less dependent upon the United Methodist Church. So the World Methodist Council purchased a high-rise office and retail building on the Prado of La Paz, and it was renamed the Cosmos Building. This was some of the most expensive real estate in South America. The top floors of the building, which had been a rich lawyer's office, became the headquarters for the IEMB, and the remainder of the building was rented out to provide enough income to pay a significant portion of the salaries for the pastors of the IEMB.
So under the leadership of GBGM's, quote, Episcopal candidate, unquote, for 1978, the IEMB decided to have the church borrow enough money from a bank to purchase vehicles for each district. I'm sure he wanted to do this because it would help these district and national leaders do a better job. And he also probably saw it as a way to demonstrate his leadership capabilities and how pastors would benefit from him being elected bishop. The collateral for the loan was the Cosmos Building. But then hyperinflation hit, and within a year the church couldn't make the payments on the loan, and the bank prepared to foreclose and take ownership of the vehicles and the Cosmos Building. But thank goodness, GBGM realized what a disaster that would be and stepped in. They returned the Jeeps, and GBGM paid Toyota the difference between what the Jeeps were worth and the amount of the loan, thus keeping Cosmos in the IEMB. This was incredibly important, as the Cosmos Building to this day is one of the 2 key incomes which pay for pastor salary. The other is the Bolivian Methodist Pastors Endowment Fund. But after this fiasco, quote, their man, unquote, had no chance to be elected bishop. Now there was no doubt that the next bishop would be Aymara, and the remainder of the time leading up to the 1978 General Assembly and a couple of years following 1978 were extremely difficult and painful for the IEMB for multiple reasons. For the indigenous people to bring democracy into the IEMB and gain control of their own church, they had to hurt the ones they loved. The missionaries who had sacrificed so much and faced arrest and expulsion to promote and educate the indigenous people were now leaving them. The indigenous leadership never asked them to leave, but all the U.S. missionaries were gone within a year or two. Many of the missionaries probably wondered why they even taught the Aymara in the first place, and for some, the scars remained for a lifetime.
And it wasn't just the U.S. missionaries who left. Most, if not all, of the pastors from other South American countries left for appointments elsewhere. And worst of all, most of the Bolivian mestizo pastors also left, often to receive appointments to serve Spanish-speaking United Methodist churches in Illinois, Texas, and California.
Many were angry
that this had happened, and they left the church. Besides, some of them were not about to be in a church where the indigenous were the leaders, and the Hispanic mestizo elite were mere church members. However, a few of the U.S. missionaries left Bolivia with a triumphal attitude. Hallelujah, we've accomplished our mission from God. There is now a fully authentic native Bolivian Methodist church ready to stand on its own 2 feet. And they left not out of anger, but because they knew that for the indigenous Methodists to mature and grow in their leadership, they needed for the missionaries to leave. It was like a parent who had trained and educated a child as much as they could, but now needs to encourage the child to leave home and become their own independent adult selves. Well, in this case, the child needed to stay and the parent needed to leave. Jack Robinson was the last GBGM missionary to leave Bolivia in 1981. He stayed on longer because he was not a threat to the indigenous leadership. In fact, he never held a conference-wide office. He was a pastor who could and did preach in Aymara and was deeply loved and respected by the indigenous Methodist people. So it was for some of the missionaries. They had trained and educated the indigenous Methodists, but for them to become the true mature leaders taking the IEMB in new directions, the missionaries knew they had to leave. The greatest pain and conflict, however, was with their Hispanic brothers and sisters. Most of the lay and clergy Hispanic leaders within the church were deeply hurt by the move. They said, if you want to lead, okay, lead, and they sat back and their arms folded. But a few, like Rolando Viena, Dr. Herman Crespo, and Annabel Guzman, and others, said, help our Aymara brothers. We must teach them what we know how to do to lead the church so they don't make the mistakes we already know about. The Hispanic Mestizo Methodists who helped Aymara were considered by some Mestizo Methodists to be traitors to their own people. But those that remained would reply, no, we are Methodists. We want to bring popular democracy to the Methodist Church, and we're doing what is best for the Methodist Church.
For the next 2 or 3 years, frequently, when an urban Mestizo local Methodist church whose U.S. or South American missionary pastor or its Bolivian Mestizo pastor would leave for the U.S. or elsewhere, the congregation would refuse to accept the indigenous pastor that was sent to them. Then they would announce that the entire local congregation was leaving the IEMB, even though it was illegal based on the IEMB Constitution. Finally, the local leaders would padlock the church doors. But then suddenly, dozens of Aymara Methodists from the Campo would show up, use bolt cutters to open up the building, and move into the church building and sit there, sometimes weeks on end. Their demand was simple. This is an IEMB church and must remain an IEMB church. Ultimately, the congregation would finally agree to remain in the IEMB, but of course, most of its Mestizo members left the church.
The same thing happened with the American Institutes across Bolivia and other Methodist-run schools. There was one fascinating exception in the strict segregation of Aymara and Mestizo churches. It was the San Pedro IEMB in La Paz. Before 1965, San Pedro Church built a beautiful brick and glass chapel and large parsonage for what was then a Mestizo urban IEMB church with a Mestizo missionary pastor. However, it was located near the border between both Hispanic and Aymara neighborhoods in La Paz. And this lone Mestizo church reached out and evangelized among the indigenous. They had indigenous persons convert and join their congregation, and they even had some services there where the preaching was in Aymara. They begged indigenous leadership to let them continue their movement toward building a local congregation which was neither Mestizo nor indigenous, but instead was a reconciling or a multiracial or a multilingual congregation. I don't know what happened and why. It's possible that the newly empowered indigenous leadership was so angry with the Mestizo church that they weren't willing to share the power in this beautiful building. But I don't think so. All I've ever heard from them was that we wanted the Mestizo pastors and Mestizo church members to stay, but that the decision makers within the church reflect the racial and cultural profile of the majority of the members. What might have happened was that San Pedro was simply swept up in this running battle where Mestizo Methodists would try to take a church or institution and leave the IEMB and get out from under indigenous control.
And then rural indigenous Methodists would come and occupy the church building until the local church agreed to stay within the IEMB.
And in the heat of the struggle, the important differences between San Pedro and those other churches, like El Reforma, were not seen.
Who thought San Pedro wanted to leave the IEMB too, because after all, they were mestizo. But that was not the case at all, from what I've heard. The San Pedro church members wanted to stay in the IEMB, but just be this multiracial local congregation instead of a strictly indigenous church. The indigenous church leadership didn't see the difference or didn't care. They wanted San Pedro to be an indigenous church. So a group of indigenous came into the church building, occupied it, and declared that San Pedro was now an indigenous church.
But here's where it took a positive turn. The mestizo indigenous members of San Pedro said, fine, you all have the chapel, but then negotiated with the new San Pedro leadership to form a new church, El Mesías, and allow it to meet in the parsonage. The parsonage was large enough that they can seat up to 50 persons in the living room and kitchen area of the parsonage for worship. But as it is now, they have standing room worship for over 70 people or more in worship. This church continues to meet even today and participates in district and general assembly events. If it could ever reconcile and reunite with the San Pedro Church, it could become a model for the integrated urban IEMB churches all over Bolivia. For all the rest, when the leadership would not allow mestizo churches to leave the IEMB, the members left the IEMB, and the empty churches began to fill up with indigenous Methodists who lived in the cities. People also came in from the countryside to sit at an inn at the Methodist Hospital, the school offices, and the Cosmos building, all to make sure that these institutions stayed under the majority Methodist leadership. The last church to give in was La Reforma in La Paz. Some of the older Hispanic people staged their own hunger strike. They spoke on TV and in the newspapers about how the Aymara were killing them, and they asked the army to take the Aymara Methodist leaders into jail. But the army refused to become involved, and the church remains a part of the IEMB. It has an Aymara pastor, but many of its members, maybe most of its members, are mestizo, and its worship style was still very Western up until 2015 and beyond. The neoliberals in GBGM were also ready to wash their hands of the IEMB. They asked, what kind of people would kick out Mortimer Arias, the well-known Methodist theologian and author? And all our GBGM missionaries left too. Surely the IEMB must be a bunch of communists. Following the 2 years of transition in 1978, the IEMB elected Zacarias Mamani, an Aymaran pastor, as bishop. He was only the third indigenous person to lead a nationwide organization in government, industry, nonprofit organizations, economic organizations, or the churches in all of Bolivia. He was only the third Aymaran. His election was followed in 1982 with the election of Orlando Villena, a mestizo who supported the Aymara Revolution, and Villena was followed by Eugenio Poma, another Aymaran, in 1986, and every bishop since has been Aymara. Before the Aymara Revolution, the bishop had the power to choose who would serve on the executive committee. But beginning in 1978, the executive committees were elected by the General Assembly and can only serve for 2 years. Instead of district superintendents who had to be a pastor, the districts were led by district coordinators who could be lay or clergy, and the indigenous people now controlled the IEMB. With the 1978 General Assembly, the Democratic Revolution was complete. The representatives of all Methodists decided who the leadership would be and would no longer be under the overt or even the covert control of GBGM. But with GBGM no longer in control of the IEMB, GBGM in New York cut their financial support to almost zero, which was a huge blow. While the Cosmos building provided for most salaries, there was no money for church construction, evangelism, healthcare, or any projects. The Texas Annual Conference had previously provided the greatest amount of support, from financial and otherwise, for specific projects of the IEMB, such as church construction, pastoral education, vehicles, and other needs. But the Texas Conference and all the other conferences who had supported them slowed down
or completely cut off
their support to see what would happen. And the U.S. missionaries were the ones who raised individual donations from the United States for construction, equipment, and other needs of the IEMB. They had the connections. They spoke to U.S. churches when they were on furlough. But when the missionaries left, the financial support needed to run those projects began to dry up too.
There were those in GBGM and the Texas Annual Conference who sincerely believed the IEMB was filled with communists and led by them. And yes, there were a few Methodists who had, when they were younger, been communists. But it was because at those times, before 1968, no one was fighting for the indigenous rights other than the communists. But when people began to see a Christian church, the Iglesia Evangelica Methodista in Bolivia, working, marching, and speaking out on behalf of the indigenous, they left the Communist Party and became Methodists.
The IEMB pleaded with the UMC, please come to Bolivia, see what is happening. See, we are not communists, we are still Methodists. We are only trying to do what you did with the American Revolution.
But they never came down to Bolivia to see for themselves. They simply took the word of the angry and disappointed missionaries who were returning to the United States. I guess the missionaries who supported the true independence of the IEMB were never asked by the United Methodist Church leadership what they thought. Dr. Crespo, a mestizo who supported the revolution, was elected by the First General Assembly to be the head of services, which is responsible for the hospital and all of the schools. It also put him on the Central Executive Committee. I was blessed to be able to interview in depth this man who was a member of the first indigenous elected Central Executive Committee, and in the very middle of the struggles of the new indigenous IEMB leadership trying to figure out how to keep the church going without the support of the Texas Conference and the General Board of Global Ministries. We can see inside what the decision-making process was.
But they didn't came to see us and to ask us what we are doing or what is our problem or let's see. No, only from New York they say, oh no, these crazy people, well, the distance between New York and La Paz, it wasn't only this in miles, but it was historically, they didn't understand it.
The opposition to the IEMB in the U.S. was led by the former ally, the Texas Conference, but they wouldn't come either.
Texas Church, yes, because Texas Church was the main conference supporting us. And they said, no more help for you. So, okay, we said, if you don't want to help us, don't help us. But no money for salaries. Yeah. This big hospital, this big school, how can you? Oh, it was terrible.
The only significant income was from the Cosmos building, and it barely covered the cost of salaries for the pastors. However, the IEMB owned and operated this big hospital, these two big schools, and the administration staff. How could they fund all of that?
At this low point, Bolivian leaders like Herman Crespo, Eugenio Poma, and others who had traveled or lived in the United States said, Texas and New York are not the total of the United States. Let's look for some other conferences to help.
So, we say, what is United States? United States is not Texas. And then we hear a lot about California, and we decided to talk with the California Conference. And they immediately came in 79, 80, after the annual conference. The delegations from California, they didn't know nothing about anything. So our problem, but they came and they saw that we are not as bad as the people was talking about. And they say, hey, yes, we can help you. And that was our salvation in somehow, because they wanted to kill us, cutting all the economy support. So with California we begin again, and it makes the change in New York, because if California is recognizing us, so New York must think twice what they are doing. Bishop Crutchfield from Texas, they invited us.
An aside, Bishop Crutchfield was elected bishop from the Boston Avenue United Methodist Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and of course knew the special relationship between the church and the missionary Murray Dixon. Well, the California-Nevada Conference led the way to challenge GBGM to rethink their position on the IEMB. And once there was a change in the officials in New York, the IEMB was able to try to rebuild the relationship with the United Methodist Church. It was very painful and very difficult time, but it really was a revolution. For only the third time in Bolivia, the Aymara people took control of a major nationwide organization, the other two being the Miners' Union and the Peasants' Union. And by the grace of God, they found their strength and their voice. These indigenous people who had been treated as empty receptacles for nearly 500 years, who had simply received and carried no responsibilities for Christ's work, now had to carry the heavy burden of the mission of the church on their own backs. With all the missionaries gone, almost all the mestizo Bolivian pastors moving to the U.S., there was a severe shortage of pastors. And we will see, they even looked to the United States, not for missionaries, but for pastors of the IEMB. It took another 5 or 6 years before GBGM and even the IEMB itself fully accepted that the IEMB was now an Aymara church, an indigenous church, a rural church. There was another fascinating result of the Aymara revolution in the IEMB. The IEMB that now is made up almost totally of the poor, where almost everyone in leadership had grown up in some small unknown village with no education, these people were now owners of the most prestigious schools in the country, filled with the children of the richest, most elite Hispanic Bolivians. The poor were teaching the children of the rich. Among the changes brought about was the institution of Robin Hood education. The American Institutes of La Paz and Cochabamba remain among the finest in all of Bolivia. From 7 a.m. to 1 p.m., all the wealthy kids come to school and pay an exorbitant tuition to receive education from some of the best and highest paid teachers with some of the best equipment in all of Bolivia. However, at 2 p.m., the school reopens using the same teachers and the same equipment, but this time it's for the poor and all those who cannot pay anything for the children's education. That's Robin Hood education. I think in the last decade or so, they have started charging some for the afternoon session, but I'm not sure how much, but I know it's significantly less than the morning session. The administration of the Methodist Hospital in La Paz has changed. Doctors had been making as much as $80,000 to $90,000 a year, an exorbitant amount equal to several $1 million in the United States. For example, the current bishop of Bolivia makes about $800 a month. To pay those salaries, they naturally had to charge high fees for the hospital, and only the wealthiest of people could afford it. That has changed. The salary of doctors has been limited to $1,200 a month, still a quite good salary by Bolivian standards. The doctors are allowed to hold clinics and have private offices to work after hours. This is another way for them to supplement their income. The hospital then lowered its prices and began to serve more and more people who could pay nothing. While this has been a great gift to the poor, the hospital has become increasingly unable to replenish its medical equipment. With only 40 or so pastors serving 160 church, as well as bishop, all of the executive committee, and chaplains, there weren't enough pastors to go around, so the church had developed a system of lay pastors. Each year, local congregations meet to elect their lay pastor for the year. The lay pastor is expected to spend most of his or her time working for the church. Now, since most of the churches are filled with the poorest people who cannot afford to donate much, local pastors received initially no pay for their work. Typically, the congregation, after selecting whom their local pastor would be for the coming year, then takes turns sharing in the farming work of that lay pastor. Someone whose sheep are grazing near the local pastor's herd will watch the lay pastor's herd. Someone whose potato field is next to the lay pastor's field will plant and harvest his field for him. So the one who is selected to be the lay pastor receives no pay, but he does receive the produce from his flock and his field while other church members do his farming. In the last few years, a very, very small stipend, approximately $50 a month, has been given to local pastors to help them with their costs such as traveling to meetings and district educational events. These are just some of the ways in which the Methodist Church, run for the poor, by the poor, functions in Bolivia. During this period, there were times the Aymara Methodists felt like Peter, waiting to deny their calling and deny that they were part of the Aymara movement, to deny that they were even Methodists. But the leaders and the people continued to bear this cross that they had chosen and carry the burden of Christ's mission from the poor to the poor. But the IEMB, along with the Methodist Church of Brazil, are unique churches. The IEMB is not in mission to the poor. It is a mission of the poor. Beginning with Bishop Eugenio Poma in 1986, up and including current bishop, that's 9 bishops over 35 years, every bishop of the IEMB came from a poor, illiterate family living in an indigenous rural village with no electricity or potable water. And the church educated them, and they became bishops. Because the bishops, executives, and pastors were all from rural indigenous villages, the church immediately recognized the connection between proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ and the need of the church to work on economic development, public health, and human rights for the indigenous people. This holistic gospel resonated with the indigenous people. Soon, Methodist churches were spreading across the countryside of Bolivia. In 1975, with the help of 60 to 80 North American missionaries, there were only about 2,000 Methodist church members. However, now that the missionaries were gone and the leadership was turned over to the indigenous, the church had grown by 750% to over 15,000 by 1988. Let me say that again. They grew by 750% in 13 years. But finances, and in particular paying the salaries of the indigenous pastors, became very difficult. The indigenous church members made less than $2 a day. There were offerings, but they collected very, very little cash. The salaries had been paid through the World Service Apportionment of the UMC through General Board of Global Ministries, GBGM. But that support had been withdrawn. Where would they get the money to pay the salaries? They did realize that they now owned this huge, beautiful office space, the Cosmos building. Some indigenous felt it was inappropriate to have the offices of the IEMB in such a nice and expensive building when the average income of the church's indigenous people was so low. In fact, some rural indigenous people would not go up to the offices on the top floor because they had never used an elevator before and it was too scary. So the IEMB rented out the top 2 floors of the office space to some law firm for a high price, which was used to help pay pastor salaries. They then instructed the pastor who was serving at La Reforma Church next to the American Institute to find other housing. The parsonage, with its 6 to 8 bedrooms, that's right, 6 to 8 bedrooms, became the conference headquarters building. On my first trip to Bolivia in 1987, I met Bishop Eugenio Poma in his office. His office was the former master suite at that house. He officed in the bedroom. The master bath was not used as a bathroom, but as a storage unit for the bishop to store reports and books, and his secretary sat in an extremely small closet with folding doors and no windows off of the bedroom office. When I made a comment about how hard it must be to work in this tiny, cramped room, Bishop Poma said, quote, "David, the bishop is the servant of the people, not its lord and master. If the owner of the house had a servant, would they live and work in the largest, nicest rooms or in the smallest and most humble rooms?" Unquote. From that day, I never remodeled an office in any of the churches I served over my remaining 30 years as a local pastor in the United Methodist Church. The decorations and wallpaper that were there when I arrived were still there when I left. When I was at Skytook United Methodist Church, we recarpeted the entire building except my office. And when the youth director heard about why I didn't recarpet, he chose not to recarpet his office either. We worked in servants' quarters with old carpet. As I've said, the bishop of the IEMB was only the third person who would be recognized as a spokesperson for the indigenous people in all of Bolivia. Here's why that is important. Just as the Catholic Church in Poland became the center of opposition to communism in Poland, and the Anglican Church became the center of opposition to apartheid in South Africa, and the Lutheran Church the center of opposition to communism in East Germany, now the IEMB became the center of the fight for human rights and equality of the indigenous in Bolivia, and Bishop Zacarias Mamani became the spokesperson for the indigenous people of Bolivia. There was a strong awareness throughout the church that God had just placed an incredible mission on the back of the IEMB to bring equality and human rights for the indigenous people of Bolivia. What they didn't know was the huge cost of this mission in terms of imprisonment, torture, and martyrdom. But the biggest and most surprising impact of the Aymara revolution within the IEMB was yet to come. They knew they had just lit a spark. They blew it up into a fire to change the IEMB. What they didn't know is that it would be one of the critical sparks which lit the fire and became the Aymara movement to bring democracy and freedom for the indigenous people in all of Bolivia. And then God's ruah, God's wind, God's breath, God's spirit would blow even harder, leading the fight for human rights for indigenous people throughout all of South America. In 2019, 41 years after the election of Zacarias Mamani as bishop, I interviewed Dr. Crespo about his thoughts about what impact the Aymara Revolution in the Iglesia Evangelica Metodista in Bolivia had on history. Dr. Herman Crespo, a mestizo, as we shall see later in the podcast, became deeply involved in the indigenous Aymara Revolution in national politics and in the election of an Aymara president in 2006. Here's what he said.
Well, one of the things that maybe we can say about all around this history is that what happened in the Methodist Church with the Indian people is not only changed the history and the way we are building the new Bolivia, but in all the Indians in South America. Because the impact that we had, it had a big influence in the 40 million of Indians that they are living in Latin America.
Yeah.
Since Mexico to Chile to Argentina, what we did had a very, very big impact to make dream again the Indian people that they can be part of the construction of the new society in South America. For the first time, they are talking about the multicultural and the multinational nations, you see? And it began with all these fights, struggle, works with the Methodist Church. So we can say that part of this big movement is because the Methodist Church, we put a small part in this. It was inspired by the all Indian nations in South America.
Herman went on to say that the Aymara Revolution within the Methodist Church was the first real awakening among the indigenous people. They saw the IEMB, Bishop Zacarias Mamani, and others that followed and realized that they, the indigenous person, were capable of running things. They could run a government, and the Bolivian indigenous began to gain a belief in themselves. That gave them the belief that they could and should run the Bolivian government, as they too represented a huge majority of the population. Dr. Crespo goes on to say that having an indigenous president, an indigenous party in power in Bolivia, gave hope for the indigenous peoples throughout Latin America. And it all started with 7 indigenous pastors, frustrated, angry at the hypocrisy of the IEMB and its bishop. So they started a Bible study reflection group, and God spoke to them, led them, and then started a revolution that transformed the IEMB, the nation of Bolivia, and the human rights of indigenous people throughout Central and South America. Just 7 people. This is the conclusion of Season 3 and my telling of the story of the Aymara Revolution. I know I'm missing a lot. Unfortunately, I haven't had a chance to spend as much time with Felipe Sacedo as I'd like, who was right in the middle of all of it.
And thanks to Gustavo Loza, I once got to speak to Alejandro Huachaya, who is one of the great leaders of the revolution, but I wish I would have gone more times.
I know there's more from the side of the missionaries. There's more from the Episcopal leadership. But unfortunately, that's all the information I have at this time. I hope in the future that I will be able to go to Bolivia and do some more interviewing and perhaps add to the story at that time. But for now, this is what I have on the Aymara Revolution. I would love to have people give comments, disagreements, what they liked about it, what's surprising that they've heard, anything that you'd like to add.
And post it in the comments section on YouTube.
And we'll have a discussion there. You can also do this on my Facebook page, which is listed below. Our next season,
which will begin next week,
is called The Saints and Martyrs of the IEMB. It will tell the stories of the people who were arrested, tortured, threatened during the 1980 military coup of Garcia Mesa. This is by far the most fascinating part of the story, in my opinion, and you won't want to miss it. See you soon.